Hello and welcome to Newfoundland and Labrador Studies 2205. This is Unit 4, Towards the Future. I'm Miss Fleming, your instructor for this course, and this is Section 2, Lesson 1, on Resettlement. When Newfoundland and Labrador became a Canadian province, the population distribution was spread out in 1,200 communities along 30,000 kilometers of coastline. A large proportion of these settled places were small, inshore fishing communities. Many were also on islands and in locations without access to roads. Future construction would be too expensive in these areas, and because of these reasons is why a resettlement program was created. Now, there were reasons to move at this time. With improvements to education, healthcare, and other public services, the government was hard-pressed to financially maintain these remote communities. Many people also found it difficult to provide for their families in professions other than the fishery. They desired to move to larger places with modern amenities and more government services. Resettlement had been occurring naturally for decades, but it was formalized as a social and economic plan during Smallwood's tenure as Premier. So let's talk about the first official resettlement program. The first post-Confederation, government-sponsored resettlement program began in the early 1950s. The residents of 3 Bonavista Bay Islands asked the government for assistance to move closer to their winter workplace in the logging industry. The provincial government introduced the Centralization Program in 1954, which offered volunteers between $300 and $600 per household to relocate. Now, that doesn't seem like a whole lot of money. Even for that particular time, it was challenging. This image right here on the right is considered a very famous photograph from the 20th century in Newfoundland and Labrador because of its depiction of the children watching a house being towed away over the water. To receive these grants, 100% of the residents had to agree to relocate. Short-haul moves were common in the early years, with some families floating their homes, like on the last slide and on this one, to their new community. People tended to choose their new communities based on family ties or religious affiliation, and a few thousand people relocated due to this centralization, but there was not enough employment to support those who relocated. I keep thinking about the houses that were floated away to new communities, and it must have been extremely challenging. My brain keeps going to, well, what if the house tipped over? If there was anything like extreme winds or things weren't secured properly, it just seems like it was a very, very difficult thing to do. Now let's talk about the second phase of resettlement. The provincial government sought federal assistance for the second phase of resettlement in 1965, so about a decade later. The Fisheries Household Resettlement Program was established, where families were encouraged to settle in growth centres with a fish plant, roads, and infrastructure. An outport community could apply for government assistance if at least half of the householders passed a resolution to support resettlement. An elected 3-person committee then negotiated terms of the move with the government. Then a petition of 90% and later 80%, it fluctuated, of householders would have to be signed, including the name of the growth centre they intended to relocate to. When relocation was approved, households received $1,000 plus $200 for every household member. Moving expenses up to $3,000 were paid to householders. This money was reimbursed to resettlers after they moved, so not given up front. Some people would return to their previous homes in the summer to fish and maintain 2 dwellings. The government soon discouraged this and even demolished and seized property. After the 1965 program was reviewed, the Newfoundland Resettlement Program was launched in 1970 with a provincial-federal partnership. And in order to qualify, resettlers had to reside in government-designated outports, where 80% of householders had to agree to move. The relocation grant was also increased to $1,200. Between 1965 and 1970, 119 communities were resettled, totaling to 16,114 people. In such a short time frame, which is only 5 years, that is a lot of people to be moved. This picture here is of a resettled community called Harbour Buffet, and this is where Harbour Buffet was located. And you will find in the activities that we do, and the more you look into resettlement, a lot of people actually will return to those old communities, including Harbour Buffet. Now, of course, there were issues with resettlement. While the program did not become a serious political challenge, academics found that many resettlers felt manipulated into leaving their community. It was a very emotional time that pitted neighbors and family members against each other, especially with the 80% threshold. For people who could not afford a new home, the resettlement grant was not enough. Additionally, these growth centers did not have enough jobs for incoming people, especially those who had no other skills or training other than fishing. And this became a very large issue, where schools became really crowded and unemployment was very high. Services were overcrowded, like I just mentioned, even to the point of one community having to send children to school in shifts. Some academics also believe that resettlement destroyed the identity of a whole group of outport people, whose lives had been based in these communities and the fishery. This spurred a cultural nationalism which took root in music, artwork, and theatre. Remember when we talked about music in Unit 2, we referenced a return to folk music and this movement in the 1970s. This was part of that movement. I highly recommend you check out the play West Moon by Al Pittman, which is about resettlement. So now it's time to review. I have a wonderful art analysis for you to take a look at, along with a poignant episode of Land and Sea, and I hope you enjoy.